How did the COVID-19 pandemic begin? In other words, where did the virus come from? What is the origin of SARS-CoV-2? In this talk, I'm going to go through the scientific evidence that teaches us a lot about exactly how this pandemic began. First up, there are two main hypotheses that we need to consider here. It's the lab leak hypothesis, which is a range of different hypotheses, ranging from more severe, the bioweapons theory about SARS-CoV-2, to more benign versions of this, which could involve, for example, contaminated samples being brought to a lab and researchers infecting themselves. However, there's also the natural emergence hypothesis, the zoonotic spillover hypothesis, where the virus moves from an animal into the human population and then takes off in a pandemic. And this is in fact how previous epidemics and pandemics of the past have started. So when we're looking at these two hypotheses, both of them need to be considered. However, it's important to understand that we are not talking about what's possible here, because both of these are possible. However, we're talking about what we find to be most probable. In other words, what do we actually find, given all the evidence that we have, is the plausible explanation for the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. And that's important because we do have a lot of evidence, despite what many might tell you that there's very scant evidence out there. The evidence of exactly how this got started is actually quite rich. So if you look at the virus itself first and start there, the emergence of a novel coronavirus is not new. This is something we have observed many times in the past. Here's 9 examples of coronaviruses that we know have emerged in the human population of the past. I'll say some of the dates that are here is the dates of detection, not necessarily when they jumped. Something like SARS-2, we know that jumped in 2003 and again in 2004. SARS-CoV-2, for example, we know in 2019. But some of the other common cold coronaviruses, we know when we detected them first in the human population, but they had actually been spreading for a long time in the human population. So when we look at these viruses, the reservoirs, horseshoe bats for most of these, is widespread across Southeast Asia, not just in China, but across much of Southeast Asia, and in fact many other parts of the world like Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. Now, if we look at SARS-CoV-1, which is the virus that emerged again in 2002, November of 2002, and we look at SARS-CoV-2, what we can find is that SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 really are remarkably similar. They're beta coronaviruses, they use the same receptor, ACE2, they come in bats. Importantly, we're associated with the wet markets and restaurants for SARS-1 and wet markets, of course, for SARS-2. And we know that the introduction of both of these, when we're looking at the evidence, is to show they had multiple introductions. Importantly, too, is that we just look at the timing here. SARS-1 is in November 2002, and we believe the estimated timing of SARS-2 is in November of 2019. So very, very similar there as well. Importantly, too, is that when we're talking about SARS-1, is that there were multiple introductions that happened over a range of time, both in 2002, 2003, and 2004, is that that's simply because that there was no shutdowns of the wildlife trade associated with this outbreak. In fact, in the beginning, this was completely hush-hush and was not talked about. That's not true for SARS-2. Really, the effect here of the outbreak itself and the detection of this in Wuhan in December of 2019 is that the wildlife trade, including trading in markets, but also the farming itself, got shut down pretty quickly. That wasn't true for SARS-1, and also we also know now that the reservoir, the intermediate reservoir that we know exists or believe exists for SARS-2 and no exist for SARS-1, really is quite shallow when we talk about SARS-2. One other point I wanted to make between these two is that you can see I've selected Huanan here. The reason why I'm selected Huanan is that we know that this part of China and also in places like Laos, for example, is that very similar coronaviruses to SARS-1 and SARS-2 have been detected in the past. And there's a lot of fuss about it's a long way from Huanan to Wuhan. Well, but that's not mysterious. The virus can move these kinds of distances, right? Because in fact, we see this for both SARS-1 and for SARS-2. So the virus itself, when we're looking at these SARS-1, SARS-2, is that they really look remarkably similar. Of course, SARS-2 led to a pandemic versus SARS-1, which did not, which means that there has to be something unique about this virus for the simple reason that it's a pandemic virus, SARS-1 was not. Now, when we're looking about the zoonosis of these, if we look at the animals associated with these kinds of spillovers, we believe that the ultimate reservoir here are bats. However, there are intermediate animals in which the virus needs to move in order to move into the human population. We know for SARS-1, for example, we know it was raccoon dogs and civet cats that we see examples of here, for example. And we have reason to believe that it could be the same for SARS-2 as well, although we do not know this for certain. There are many other animals that are susceptible to infections, as we have seen. White-tailed deer, for example, here in the United States and elsewhere. Also, mink population all over the world have seen very susceptible. And in general, both of these viruses, but certainly SARS-2 in particular, has a really wide host range. It is able to infect a lot of different potential animal reservoirs here. Now, one thing to remember is that when we look in these viruses is that SARS-1 was actually found in Hubei. This is something most people miss, is that when we are talking about we have only detected these kinds of viruses in Yunnan or in Laos now as well, is simply not true. For the simple reason that SARS-CoV-1 was found both in wild as well as in farmed civet cats and other animals, ferret badgers, for example, in Hubei as well. And most importantly, too, is that if we are just looking at the genetics of these viruses that we find in Hubei civets versus what we found in market animals, for example, in Guangdong, is that the Hubei civet SARS-1 sequences are actually more closely related to human cases. However, it's important to understand that we can't determine directionality here, whether the virus moved, for example, from Hubei civets into Guangdong civets. We know there's exporting of animals from Hubei to Guangdong, but we can't really say which way the virus went here. This is something we're looking at very closely, hoping to have more on, but because of the limited data we have on this, is really difficult to establish. So for SARS-1, this was well established. When we looked at SARS-2 in the beginning of the pandemic and all the way through 2020 is that, well, the questions to the Huanan seafood market in which this was first detected there is that we were told that there were no animals. And of course, if there's no animals being sold at this market, they were talking about live seafood. It is a seafood market in name, but importantly in name only, is that if the animals are not there, well, it's not going to come into the seafood market or into Huanan market via those animals. And that was in fact what we have told when we read the WHO report, and what had been reported back in 2020 is that there were in fact no live mammals sold at the Huanan seafood market leading up to the pandemic. Here's the thing though, we know that's actually not true. I was certainly, and most of us were really shocked to see this paper back in 2021 from Xiao and colleagues, where actually they detail quite specifically is like the animal sales in Wuhan wet markets immediately prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it turns out that the story that there were no live animals on sale at the Huanan seafood market, as well as other markets across Wuhan, was simply not true. We know now that in fact these were on sale. We built a little extra on Xiao's study here based on that same data. And in fact, we could show that leading all the way up to the pandemic itself is that at the Huanan market specifically, we know that several susceptible animals were in fact on sale, live mammals being sold there. Things like raccoon dogs, for example, we know were sold in November. We also have photographic evidence that probably were sold in December as well. So we know that these animals that are susceptible to these kinds of viruses were in fact for sale at the Huanan seafood market leading all the way up to the pandemic. And what's important to understand here is that the wildlife trade, the wildlife farming is a huge business in China. It was shut down in February of 2020 following the eruption of the pandemic in Wuhan. But this is a big industry in China. It's an industry in which wildlife is being farmed, funneled through things like wet markets across many different places, Wuhan being one of them, South China, of course, many of these markets too. And this has been a big business for many years. And what's led to, we know, SARS-1 back in 2002 to 2004. So we know now that the animals, when we're looking at SARS-2, in fact, were for sale at the Huanan seafood market. What we also know is that the market itself, we find the evidence of the virus there when the Wuhan CDC and the China CDC went in and sampled the market. In fact, positive samples were found in stalls where these animals were being sold. So the virus itself was there. What we didn't find and what nobody found was infected animals. But what's really important here is to understand that the relevant animals were not tested. Things like raccoon dogs, for example, that we know were for sales, were in fact not tested when the Wuhan CDC came in. And probably these animals had actually been removed prior to the visit of the authorities coming to the market. So it's important to understand that when people said, oh, but we haven't found any infected animals, well, that's true. And some might also say that we have tested 80,000 animals and none of them were positive, which is also true. But here's the thing, none of the really relevant animals that you would want to test were in fact tested as part of this. So it's no surprise that none of these animals have actually turned up positive. But here's what's important. If we actually look at the evidence, just looking at the early outbreak, on trying to understand how did this outbreak unfold, is that we can just look at the cases and look at the hospitalizations, for example. If we look at the early cases, it's pretty remarkable that all these early cases, or the majority, I should say, of these early cases, really cluster around the Huanan seafood market. Now, that doesn't mean that all the cases were in fact linked to the Huanan seafood market. This virus can spread asymptomatically and doesn't necessarily lead to very severe disease, at least not in the beginning. So the fact that they're not all linked to the market is no surprise, but it's important to understand that the majority of them were. Many of the early cases were in fact linked to the market. I think even more importantly, and Michael Warby has had a paper on this, is that the hospitalizations themselves, that's actually where they realized they had an outbreak. And the reason why they realized that was, as I said, we had all these pneumonia cases and they linked back to this specific market in the middle of Wuhan, the Huanan seafood market. So when we're looking at early cases, we're looking at early hospitalizations, these show a really close connection to the market. As the outbreak takes off and spreads across Wuhan, what we will see is that now the cases start clustering everywhere. In fact, we know now that they start clustering around where you have the highest population densities, but they're now no longer linked to the market, as you would expect as the outbreaks grows in size. Importantly, too, is that if you look at the early pneumonia deaths, is that they actually also cluster in the area of Wuhan in which you had the market. So that means that the early cases, the early hospitalizations, and the early deaths, in fact, show this association with the market itself. We recently had a paper on this where we looked at this much more closely. We're actually trying to, based on the information in the WHO report and elsewhere, is that we mapped out really closely where all these cases actually located. And we did analyses on saying, like, do they really cluster around this market, or is it just, because of population density, for example, or you have places in which older people live? And it isn't. It is really clear that if you look at all these early cases in December, they really cluster right around the Huanan seafood market. If you look at B and C in this particular graph here, is that you can really see that the bullseye of these early cases really is in Huanan seafood market. Importantly, too, is that if you look at unlinked cases that didn't actually have a connection to the market itself, they also cluster really closely around the market. In fact, they even cluster closer than if you take all the cases in December of 2019. And it's not just that they cluster around the market, they are in fact also much closer to the market itself, as you would expect by chance. Similar to the other data that I showed you, is that as the outbreak grows across Wuhan, is that this changes over time, and now the virus is spreading across the city, and you see an association much more closely based on just the population density of the city itself. Furthermore, a separate paper we had at the same time, led by Jonathan Picard, and I believe he's giving a talk on Thursday, so make sure you tune into that one, is that the evidence really quite strongly suggests, or very strongly suggests, I should say, is that the virus didn't just jump once, it actually jumped twice into the human population, and likely more than that, but we see 2 successful lineages taking off. And really importantly is that these 2 spillovers were in fact linked to the Huanan market. So if you take all of this together, it's very clear that these early events of the pandemic itself really cluster around a single market in Wuhan, a market that's not much bigger than a couple of football fields, for example, and it's the bullseye as you're looking at just the early cases. If you look at the early hospitalization, the majority of them links back to the market too, and the early excess pneumonia deaths also in the area of Wuhan where you have this market. You then combine that with the evidence showing 2 spillovers, which again, Jonathan will be talking about. You have a very, very clear picture of just the market clearly being the early epicenter of the emergence itself. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that we're just talking about the different theories that can explain this, is that it's very important to realize and to remember, I should say, is that any theory about the origin of this virus must really be consistent with all facts. You can't just take facts you do like and facts you don't like and then pick and choose like that. It really has to be whatever theory you have here has to be consistent with all of these. And when we're looking at the lab leak, is that it really doesn't matter where we're trying to look. There is no evidence for it. We look in sequencing databases for early evidence of SARS-2 prior to the pandemic. There's none. We look at publications, they're published, including sequencing of viruses prior to the pandemic. There's no evidence there either. You look at the intelligence community in the United States, they had a big report on this. They didn't find anything either. And they certainly weren't set up to detect raccoon dogs, for example, but they might have been to be able to detect any evidence of a lab leak or any evidence of this virus being present in a lab prior to the pandemic. And really, every time we look for this, we come up empty-handed. There just is no evidence here. Now, importantly too is that if you ask the VIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology itself, is that they have reported that there were no COVID-19 cases at the lab. They have tested with ELISA and PCR, and they denied working with SARS-CoV-2 prior to the pandemic. Now, you can of course say that, well, I think they're all lying about that. That's your choice. But again, go back to the question of, do you actually have evidence for them doing that? Or is it just because you're simply not trusting them? So I think it's important that we keep this in mind, that when we're saying about the lab leak is that it's purely based on speculation and conjecture. There really is no evidence whatsoever that points to this particular lab. Now, when we're talking about that, is that just think for a second, saying that what facts would actually convince you of either theory. For me, it's always been that any evidence of SARS-2 in any lab prior to the pandemic, well, there you go. It's a bullseye. It came from the lab. The question is, what would actually convince you of the market being there, the zoonosis of this virus actually being the evidence? And that's a good question, because that question has moved over time and it keeps changing, because again, the amount of evidence we have for SARS-2 really is much larger than what we have for many other viruses. But let me just take you back to that market again, the Huanan Market specifically, because I showed you this before and I mentioned that they found the virus in environmental samples at the market. But I didn't give you the details, and what's important is that the details have actually been there all along. The China CDC published a report in January 2020 where they concluded that this is probably linked to the wildlife trade. In fact, we are quite certain of this. Importantly too is that the entire sampling scheme, everything they had sampled inside this market, were in fact also detailed in this report. So we can take all of those details, we can add them back into the map, and now we can ask ourselves the questions, first of all, which samples were positive? Is there any clustering of these samples? What types of samples are we talking about? And when we do that, and this is again in our recent paper here, is that when we zoom in on this, is that there's a very strong clustering of environmental positivity within the market, specifically where we now know the animals were sold, the live mammals were sold in this southwestern corner of the market. So when you have been told that there is no clustering, it's true that if you look at cases while they're on the western side of the market where they sold the animals, it's not clustered within the western market itself. But very importantly, if you look at the environmental sample positivity, which unlike people, of course, don't actually move around, is that there's a very, very strong associations exactly where the animals were sold. And in fact, the association with there being a environmental positive sample is much more associated with there being a nearby shop that we now know sold live mammals. So very, very strong clustering of just inside the market, as of course we also see outside the market. But let me bring up Eddie. So this is Eddie. Eddie is standing in front of stuff that I'm sure he knows a lot about, but Eddie is an important man. He has studied these kinds of viral evolution and viral emergence for well, his entire career basically. And here's the thing. If we go back to this clustering of these particular samples where we see this close positivity of the environmental samples inside the market, is that Eddie went there in 2014. Eddie himself went to the Huanan seafood market. He was brought there to show an example of a market in which these types of animals were being sold and where we should probably be sampling. So he went there and he took photos. Here are Eddie's photos. Now, if we take these photos, they're from 2014, remember. But if we take these photos and then we zoom in and saying like, okay, and now we know from the China CDC report which samples were actually positive in this market, is that two of these, for example, two of the positive samples were cats. Well, if we zoom in on this particular photo of Eddie's, there are two cats. They're right in that shop in which we see all this positivity. All this positivity that we see in this particular shop here is, in fact, there are these two cats that are positive, and two cats are in Eddie's photos. These carts are being used for all sorts of things, but they're used, for example, to transport around mobile cages of animals. Here's one of Eddie's other photos of a raccoon dog, for example, in one of these mobile cages. Importantly, too, is that if you look at that photo, is that there's actually a grate underneath there. And from a study from the China CDC, from Gao et al., is that we actually know that the grate outside this particular shop in which Eddie took the photos is in fact also positive for the virus itself. It's not that there are other sewage systems that are positive in the market, but this is one of the few that are actually positive for that. And again, it's a photo showing a raccoon dog actually sitting on top of one of these grates. Now, there's also a metal cage in a room. So a metal cage, well, there it is. There's one of Eddie's other photos where in a metal cage, you have raccoon dogs, for example, on top there. So that's pretty clear that when you look at these and you're showing the associations, they're clearly associated with selling of live mammals. But then there was this part which was confusing to me, which is a feather removal machine, was also positive. And I said to Eddie, what's that about? And he said, Kristian, look at my photo closely. Look at what's underneath the raccoon dogs. And here's what's underneath the raccoon dogs. Those are birds. So in fact, when you look at the raccoon dogs here, is that the raccoon dogs were sitting on top of birds. And maybe that's why the feather removal machine is positive. It could also be a human contamination. I should say that, in fact, I'm pretty convinced that most of the samples, environmental samples that are positive, are probably because of human activity. Humans that were infected, humans that brought the virus around. However, you look at a large number of these samples really are closely associated with the live mammal trade, and importantly, the positivity itself also cluster around this. Now, so if you take all of this evidence from inside the market, you have tight clustering, you have the kinds of objects that are associated with this kind of animal trails actually being positive. You take all of this evidence, you take the evidence outside the market too, you look at the tight clustering of cases, you look at the tight clustering of the hospitalizations, look at the excess pneumonia deaths, you take all of that together and you're saying, what do you actually believe best explain this data? These facts that we have observed is that what does that best explain by that? And it's not simply that the Huanan market was a super spreading event. In fact, the data is inconsistent with that idea. And as some of the data that Jonathan will show you, you bring that together with this data, it really shows you very strongly that the Huanan seafood market was in fact the early epicenter of the virus emergence. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge the people that were involved in these studies, co-senior authors with Joel and Mark and Michael, of course, but most importantly, the more junior scientists, I should say, that worked really hard on this, like Alex, Jonathan, Josh, Lorena, and Stephen. Really amazing work that they have been doing both on the scientific side as well as some of the sleuthing side, I would say, too, in figuring more of these details out. So in that, I'm just going to leave you here, and I'm happy to take any questions.